There Okay, good. Okay, so now we're ready to start, and I always begin by just for the new. Well, what do you got there? Uh, okay. So the first thing I always say when I begin the shiur is that the shiur is Leilu Nishmat, my parents, Avimori Dov Ben Reuven Halevi, Imrati Rachel Bat Michal. And I started the shiur on Zoom about a year and a half ago when I was in Avelut for my parents, and there were no minyanim. I couldn't even say Kaddish for my parents. I felt I had to do something in there in honor and memory of my parents. So we started the shiur. And Baruch Shem, it's been going for a while, but thank you again to the shul for welcoming me and for allowing me to start here. So this week's parsha is Lech Lecha, and I wanted to focus on the concept of Brit. Okay, the word in the Torah, there's a word that appears numerous times in the Torah in very many different contexts of Brit, which typically means, throw it out to everybody, covenant, pact, treaty. Okay, and I'm going to just make it even more general, an agreement that is entered among two parties. And in this week's parsha of Lech Lecha, we're going to see two different examples of a Brit where the two parties are God and Abraham as the agent, representative at this point in history of the Jewish people. And each of those, I'm going to try to compare and contrast those two Brits. But I want to start by reminding everybody that the concept of a Brit is an agreement where each party generally undertakes certain things that they will provide, they will do as part of that covenant, that pact, that treaty, whichever word you'd like to use. So I'm going to start with what we know colloquially throughout Torah literature is known as the Brit Ben HaBitarim, the covenant between the parts, which is the first one described in our parsha. It's in Parak Tet Vav of Sefer Breshit. And you'll notice, I'm going to show this in two different versions as we go through the night. But the first version, I've tried to highlight the fact that the beginning, the opening part of this is a dialogue. Okay, the blue is God speaking. The yellow is Avraham speaking. And the interesting thing about this one, which we're going to, as I said, we're going to contrast to another Brit that's going to happen later in the Parsha, is the fact that this one really is not pinpointed directly in time. It happens achar hadvarim ha'ela. The chapter starts with, after these things happen, this is what now the Torah is now going to describe. So there is no definitive date or age of Avraham at the time this Brit is happening. And that leads, of course, to a field day among the Mefarshim. There are those that say that this part of this chapter of the Torah is in chronological order, and hence it happens somewhere between the time Avraham is 75 and he's 86. And there are those that say this parsha is totally out of chronological order because it happened before Avraham was even 75. And there's a rationale for both those, but the Torah's perspective is it's not important at this point to know exactly when this happened, and that's why it introduces it by Achar Advarim Ha'ela, after these things happen. So it starts with Hayadav Hashem al Avram. God speaks to Avram b'machazeh. The word b'machazeh, generally interpreted in a chazon, in a vision. And if we go to Rambam's understanding of the whole concept of prophecy, every time it says in the Torah that God spoke to somebody other than Moshe Rabbeinu, it was in a prophecy. It wasn't that they heard him the way we are communicating back and forth, the way we speak to each other. The exception is Moshe Rabbeinu. All of the other prophets heard God's word, but they heard it in either in a dreamlike trance or in a dream or some less than fully conscious state. So God speaks to Avram and says, Al tira Avram, you don't need to be afraid. Avram, Anochi Magen Lach, I am your shield. There's great reward waiting for you because of all the things you've done. Now, to put this chapter in context, it is immediately after we have read about the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings, how the 5 kings lose the war. Avram's nephew, who's living in Sodom, is taken as a captive. Avram goes to rescue him. He fights against the 4 kings who have just been victorious, defeats them, is able to restore all of the captives and all of their property. And God says, don't be afraid. So Rashi clearly says, oh, well, what was Avram afraid about? He was afraid that as a result of his success in the war, he might have lost some of his merits, and therefore God reassures him, don't worry, these all were people who, you don't have to worry that you killed people who were super righteous people, don't worry about it. God said, Avram says back to God in the yellow, Matitanli. Okay, it's very nice. You said, promised me great reward, but what kind of reward am I going to get? I have no future. I have no children, hence I have no future. Again, a very powerful statement in 3 short words. Avram says, if I have nobody to give my legacy to teach my values, to teach about you, what purpose is there for me to go on? So already the Torah is given us in these words of Abraham one of the most important lessons that we're going to learn throughout all of our lives. And that is that we have to take what we have achieved or accomplished with the help of God and be able to transfer it to others in order for us to continue on in life. Even after we're dead. And there's a fabulous, famous midrash that says that the righteous are called alive even after they're dead, and the dead are called, the wicked are called dead even when they're alive. And the rationale behind that statement is, and the commentaries elucidate on it, is that when we have somebody who takes our place and builds and continues our legacy, it's as if we're still alive. And I think that's why we place such emphasis on raising children, whether they're our own biological children or they are our students in school. They might be because for whatever reason we haven't yet been blessed with children. We are helping, interacting with other people's children, grandchildren, as, quote, surrogate parents or surrogate role models. All of that is part and parcel of keeping our legacy alive. So Amram very, very clearly says to God, how am I going to do that? I don't have anybody who is going to follow in my footsteps. Except then he says, Ben Meshach Besiuda Mesek Eliezer, this person Eliezer of Damascus or whoever it is, happens to be his right-hand man, as we're going to see in 2 weeks from now when he sends Eliezer, nameless, who remains nameless in the whole part. This is the only time his name is mentioned in the Torah. In Chayesara, he's going to send this Eliezer, at least that's the commentaries assume he was, to find a wife, to be the one to select a wife for Yitzchak. So obviously he has great confidence in him, but he doesn't see him as an heir to his legacy. Yes, he himself is righteous, but he doesn't feel that he will be able to transmit Avram's values on in the same way that if he had his own son, that he'd be able to. And then again, Avram continues, God, Hein Lilo Natat Zara, here I am, whatever age he is. Again, that's the Torah doesn't mention how old he was. I have no children. This Damasek Eliezer is going to be the one who's going to inherit all of my stuff and all of my values. And how's that going to work? God answers him, Lo Yirosh Chazeh. He is not the one who will carry on your legacy. You will have somebody who will be your biological offspring who will carry on your legacy, which Abraham at this point seems to accept. He's okay with that. And God goes further. God takes him outside. Again, this is all part of this dream. He walks outside. God tells him to walk outside. And he says, Go and count the stars if you think you can. Now, I guess if you're in Modi'in or you're in New York City, not a whole lot of stars to count. But Avram is living, before they had electric lights at night. I suspect he had a lot brighter vision of stars than we get on an average night here. And obviously, if we really have the right telescopes and the right lighting conditions, we realize that there are millions, trillions, billions, trillions, who knows how many stars there are in the galaxies of all the universe. I mean, we know how many we can see, but Okay, and Vayomer Lo, and God says to him, Ko Yeh Zarecha. you will have as many offspring as there are stars in the heavens. Okay, that's where we get this concept of God is going to repeat it later to other patriarchs, but this is the first time we have this concept of it, that Abraham, the Jewish people are supposed to be as numerous as the stars of the heavens. He believed, and then parenthetically says, he trusted God. It's God. Avram completely trusts God, and God considers this as a righteousness. He counts it in his favor. And then the dialogue continues. God says to him, I am God who took you out of Ur-Kasdim. Now, Ur-Kasdim has two very different translations if we look at it. One is it's a place name, or you are the city in the Kasdim in the country of the Chaldees, near somewhere near the Tigris-Euphrates junction, somewhere out there in Iraq, Iran, who knows where it is. And according to that interpretation, God, this is referring to God telling Abraham, go and leave where you are and go to Eretz Yisrael. And it's to give you this land as an inheritance. Okay, so God is spelled out here as he did at Lech Lecha. He says, I will make your name great and all these other things. But here he spells out, you're going to get this land. This land is going to be your inheritance. And Abraham says to God, okay, that's very nice. Please give me a sign. How will I know? What sign will I know that my offspring will be able to inherit? Now, the Midrash wants to tell us that Abraham is concerned that God is making a conditional covenant with him. The condition is that the Jewish people will accept God to live according to God's rules. And God's gift to the Jewish people, once they abide by those rules, is the Holy Land. Very nice. But what happens when his children are going to sin? Abraham wants to ask God, what's going to happen when they sin and they're going to get thrown out of Israel? What's going to happen then? So God tells him, I'll take me a bunch of animals. And then in verses 10, 11, and 12, Avram takes them. He cuts them in half, but the bird he doesn't cut. There are four animals. There's a calf, a goat, and a ram, and two birds. And the birds do not get cut in half. The animals do. And then it says, God now communicates with Avram. After, again, Avram goes through this. Again, is he doing all this in reality, or is he doing all this in the dream? Depends on how we go back to that first word, B'machazeh. Was this a vision, this whole thing a vision, or was part of it? He sees this vision, God tells him to do this, he does it, and then the vision, then he has again, he falls, because in verse 12 it says, Avram again falls into a deep trance-like sleep. So all of these things, as I said, according to one opinion, it's all one dream. He sees himself falling asleep in the dream. We've all had, stranger dreams. I know I have. I don't know about everybody else, but I've had stranger dreams than this one. And then God speaks to Avram, and it's a rather lengthy speech here. He tells Avram, you must know that your children, your descendants will be strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them. Presumably the owners of the land will enslave them. They will afflict them, comma, period, end of sentence, 400 years. So the 400 years here is left as which one is 400 years? We don't know. The nation that will enslave them, God says, I will judge. They'll go out with great possessions. And these two verses we should be very familiar with because they are quoted in the Haggadah. Every year we say them in the Haggadah, how God knew, Avram Avinu already knew that there was going to be a slavery before the Jews were going to inherit the land of Israel, that this was, quote, part of the price that they had to, this was part of the growing process for the Jewish people, was going through this period of slavery, of servitude. But God says to Avram, you don't have to worry about that. You will go, you will reach your end in peace. You'll be buried. The fourth generation, that after they get to this foreign land, will return. Because at that point in time, after 4 generations, the land will be ripe to be conquered because the inhabitants of the land will have filled their quota of sin. Okay, that's what he says to Avram. Again, a very, very interesting prophecy. As I said, we quoted in the Haggadah. And by the way, in the Haggadah, we darshan the fact that the 400 years really begins with from the time Avram has descendants. So they were not in Egypt for 400 years. They were not slaves in Egypt for 400 years. They were not afflicted for 400 years. There was a 400-year period from the birth of Yitzchak till the Jews left Egypt. Okay, that's the traditional chronology, and there are proofs from Sukkim that they could not possibly have been in Egypt the entire 400 years. Anyway, the story continues that the sun sets, and then Avram in his dream sees a furnace, and a torch passing through the parts. Now, the Midrash says that this was the way that people sealed a covenant. They divided something in half and they walked between it together to show that just as these two parts were part of the whole, that the parties to the covenant are now parties are joined through this covenant. And now the pasuk continues. On that day, God creates a covenant with Avram, saying, the covenant here is between God and Avram, but it's through his descendants, because the descendants are the ones who are going to get this land. The land extends from Nahar Mitzrayim, generally translated as Wadi al-Arish, the border of Egypt, Ad Nahar Gadol Nahar Paras, till the Euphrates River. Now, if you study Jewish history, you'll find that the times throughout history where the Jews were able to control all of what we would call Eretz Canaan, the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River Valley, and southward and westward and northward and eastward to the Euphrates, were few and far between. So I think there were like 3 periods in time where that was all under Jewish control. One would be under Solomon, the other would be under Jeroboam II, and the third was under Jonathan Hyrcanus, slightly before the Roman times. Those are the only 3 periods of times where Jewish dominion extended that far. However, God says that will happen, and then it lists 10 different nations. Although, even though later on when he speaks to Moses, it's only 7. There are 3 of these nations that disappeared. Midrashically, those are the 3 nations that will fall under our control in times of Mashiach, in addition to what we have. So that's covenant number 1. Basically, God says to Avram, there's going to be this period that the nation's going to have to go through of 400 years before it's ready to inherit this land. But the promise is they will get the land. That's the promise. We go now to the next chapter, which is hold on 1 second. What am I doing here? 1 minute. I apologize. Something just wrong on my computer. Okay. Next chapter. Okay. Chapter 17. This is actually 2 chapters later in the Torah. There's a chapter in between where the Torah describes the birth of Yishmael, and then we have chapter 17. Avraham ben Tishim shana v'teshnim. Now this one, as I said, as opposed to the other one where it doesn't put any time frame other than after these things, here it specifically tells us Avram is now 99 years old. The verse immediately before this tells us that Avram was 86 years old when Yishmael was born. Now clearly, that's why I say the maximum that the previous one could have was when Avram was 86, because Yishmael is not referenced there. He's not even born. Avram says, I have no children. And Avram clearly recognized Yishmael as his son. He doesn't, as we're going to see here on. So the fact that in the previous chapter that we just talked about, he doesn't mention Yishmael. He says, I have no children, clearly shows that was at least before Yishmael was born. Okay. Avram is 99 years old. God again appears to Avram and tells him the following. Again, God is speaking in blue. Ani kel shaddai hitalech lefanai v'yetamim. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be pure. And again, I will form a covenant between me and you. I will multiply you greatly. Now remember, at this point he has 1 son, Yishmael. Okay. Avram again, Avram al panav. Avram falls on his face. Again, this is part of the machazeh, the dream, the vision. And again, God speaks to him. Now here again, you'll notice that the yellow seems to have disappeared. Only shows up way down here. Avram says one thing. You'll notice this is basically almost exclusively God speaking to Avram, as opposed to the other one where Avram is interjecting, is asking questions. Here, it's basically all God speaking. So that's why I wanted to highlight the speaking parts, just to get an idea that this is really God communicating directly with Avram. Okay? He says the following, I think we're familiar with this, that God basically changes his name from Avram, literally, which is Av Aram, the leader in Aram, to Avraham, Avhamon Goyim, the leader of a multitude of nations. So Avram now has basically taken on a new role vis-a-vis the world, that Avram is now to be a role model, not just in his local area, but throughout the world. And if we think about it, we're not living in a time where there's TV and whatever. It's very challenging for somebody to get word spread all over the world. So clearly, God is giving Avram a promise that's not intended to be filled necessarily by him, but clearly sometime in the future where his descendants will spread his legacy throughout the entire world. And he continues, you'll multiply greatly, and then we continue. Now we have another covenant. God established another covenant between me, God, and you, and Zaracha Acharecha L'Dorotam, your progeny throughout all of the generations. Livrit Olam, an eternal covenant. So Avram's descendants have with God an eternal covenant. By the way, if we go through later on through the rest of Sefer Bereshit, we find that it doesn't necessarily apply to all of Avram's descendants. It applies primarily to the descendants of Yitzchak, and through Yitzchak, descendants of Yaakov, as we see in later communications between God and Avram, God and Yitzchak, God and Yaakov, that the Jewish people basically are who is intended by this, that we are to be the ones who have this eternal covenant with God. And that covenant doesn't mean that we're better than anybody else, that we're greater than anybody else. It means we have a different role to play in God's world, that we have been chosen for a unique role because of who Avraham was, that we have to spread his legacy to the entire world, and not doing it by saying how much greater we are than everybody else, but by living the way Avraham wanted us to live. And that's really the key focus of this whole point. Livrit Olam, that is eternal covenant with God, but to live according to God's rules. Okay, and in return for that, in exchange for that, again in Pasuk Chet here, we see he says, I will give, as my part of the covenant, your part of the covenant is to spread the word of God. My part is you get Eretz Yisrael. That's your gift. Now, God says there's another part to this covenant. The first covenant, that was the whole thing. You're going to be slaves. You're going to get Eretz Yisrael. That's the whole covenant. Now God adds a whole different part to the covenant. And there's a question as to, is it the same covenant, is it a different covenant? But here, Vayomer Elohim al Avraham, God says, Avram, atat priti tishmor. You have to guard this covenant. There has to be something tangible that will remind you on an ongoing, every day, every generation basis that there exists this covenant between the Jewish people and God. And what is it? Zot priti atir sher tishmeru, verse 10. What we call, of course, Brit Milah. The whole concept of Brit Milah, and why it's Brit Milah, it's not just Milah, getting circumcised, it's this circumcision, as the verse 11 says, it's not just a covenant, it's a sign and a covenant. So we have both the sign and a covenant. Now, oat, throughout the Torah, always refers to something that is a sign, that is visible to those who see it, to either show them something or remind them of something, or both. The examples we have are, the first time we have an os mentioned is in the creation chapter. It says that the sun and the moon and the stars are going to be li'otot u'lemoadim. They will be signs. They will show us how to divide time up by their movement, their motion. The second time we have oat mentioned is when God places gives Cain some type of recognition that everybody knows it's Cain and that he shouldn't just kill him because he's Cain. And then throughout that, we have, of course, when Moshe is going to Paro, he is delivering otot lumoftim, this concept of oat. And we have in the midst, there are 3 mitzvot, actually, in addition to Brit Milah, we have 2 other mitzvot that are called oat, that are symbols, that are things that we have with us all the time. One, of course, is Shabbat. Ot hi ben yivnechem, v'shem b'nei Yisrael Shabbat l'olam, brit olam, ben yivnei Yisrael ot hi l'olam, ki sheish yomim asah Hashem el shmayim v'aretz yom hashvi shvat nafash, that we keep the Shabbos to remind us continually, all the time, God creates the world. And the third, of course, is what we wear on our hands and head all day, the tefillin. These 3 are tangible signs that are to constantly remind us, the Jewish people, of our relationship with God and our commitment to God. God didn't just commit to us that he's going to give us Eretz Yisrael. It's not an unconditional gift. It's a conditional gift, and we have to always remember that we have part of the bargain to live up to. We have obligations to God, just like God has an obligation to us to give us the Holy Land. And when we don't live up to that obligation, as we know through Jewish history, God takes that gift away. It's a gift, but it's not an unconditional gift. It's a conditional gift. Okay. And then, again, God says that the importance of Brit Milah is such that a male who chooses not to have a Brit Milah has basically cut himself off from the Jewish people. He has basically shown that I'm not interested in being part of the Jewish people. The Chavetz Chaim gives an example. He says, a storekeeper who has a store, and he goes out for a break. He doesn't take down his sign. He doesn't take down all the sign that says this is Joe's store. He just puts a little thing in the window that says back in 5 minutes. Whereas when he goes out of business, he takes the sign down because he's no longer renting the place. That's the Brit Milah. When we don't perform Brit Milah, we've basically taken the sign down and said we're not in the business of being part of the Jewish people. The exception, of course, is somebody who, for medical reasons, cannot have a Brit Milah, or has had cases where in the family there is a problem with Brit Milah. But generally, a Jew who chooses not to have Brit Milah is willfully saying, I don't want to be part of the Jewish people. Okay. Interestingly enough, now we have a paragraph. I highlighted this in purple just to show that this is the end of the paragraph. God now speaks again to Avraham and tells him that Sarah is now going to change her name, because the change of name, we know that Mishanim, there are certain things that change a person's mazal, that change a person's, I want to say luck is not the right word, that change a person's fate, that change who they are. One of them is changing their location, moving. The other is changing their name. And so God changes both Avram and Sarah's names. And God tells them that through her, begam natati mimena lecha ben, God says here in verse 16, that through Sarah you will have a son. The fact that you had a son through Hagar, Yishmael, doesn't count. You're going to have a son with Sarah. He's going to be named, she'll have a son. And I will bless him, and he. And Avram doesn't believe this. He thinks, wait a minute, how is that possible? I'm 100 years old. We've been married all these years and we haven't had a kid. Now suddenly I'm going to have a kid. Now she's 90 and I'm 100. We're suddenly going to have a kid. So, and then he says to God, Lu Yishmael Halavai, that Yishmael should survive. I hope that Yishmael should survive. I'm not worried about, anything else. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, but God says, okay, Yishmael will do fine, but Sarah will have a son. And by the way, God tells him you're going to call his name Yitzchak. Yitzchak here is named by God. He is granted by God. And the rationale, at least points to the Mefarshim, is that Yitzchak is born, even though he's born, yes, in the natural way, but he's born in a clearly much more miraculous than the average birth way. The fact that parents have lived all these years and haven't had children, it's to show that he is God's chosen, that he could never under the natural order, without the direct intervention of God, he could not have come to existence. And that is, again, we the Jewish people have to always remember that as part of our legacy, that our legacy is that God put us here. And we have to always remember that. Okay. And that's basically the end. And then God says, don't worry about Yishmael. He'll do fine on his own. He'll have 12 princes, and he'll be also a great nation. And ultimately, Briti Akimet Yitzchak, my covenant will be with Yitzchak, who will be born to Sarah, Lamoed Hazeh B'Shana Acharet, at this time in another year. And then the parsha basically continues and ends with the fact that Avram fulfills what God commanded. God just commanded that every male has to be circumcised. He goes and circumcises himself. He circumcises his son Yishmael, which is why and Yishmael happens to be 13 at the time, which is why among the Arabs, or at least it used to be, I don't know if it is today, it used to be that you had circumcision not at 8 days as we do, but at age 13, which is probably a little more challenging, but it is what it is. And that's the end of our parsha. So again, two covenants. The thing that they both have in common is the fact that there's Eretz Yisrael, but there's something that has to take place in order for us to gain Eretz Yisrael and to stay in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that was way one of looking at this as dialogue between God and Abraham. I want to pause this moment and open it up for a few questions, comments, what people are thinking about at this point before I take another completely different look at this chapters. So anybody?
Well, I've been thinking very much about the fact that how you describe the conversation between Hashem and Abraham, and I was thinking that if we seek Hashem with all our heart, then there's a very good chance that we're going to hear his voice, not the sound, but we'll know that he's speaking to us. And I was just wondering, an experience that I had recently. I was walking down to the mall, and I was talking to Hashem. I was actually thanking him that on that particular day, I was walking without pain in my back. And
good thing to thank Hashem for.
I was enjoying the walk because I wasn't in pain. And I was thanking him very much for it. And I had a conversation. I was telling him, oh, it's so beautiful, the development there on the east side of the building. I was just enjoying a beautiful day. And I felt as if Hashem was listening and was pleased. On the way back, I was waiting at the traffic light to cross over. And it turned green, and I started to walk, and then I did something. I looked around the vehicle, and there a car rushed through. Didn't have the right of way. Now, I think that was the kind what Abraham was experiencing in God speaking to him.
I think there are a lot of times where we feel there is no question that God is communicating with us lots of times when we know about it, when we realize it, when we don't. So there's certainly no question that the fact that we're cognizant, when we're cognizant of God in our lives, we realize a lot of things that we may have taken for granted if we didn't. So there's no question that clearly God, however, as I said, how God communicated with prophets, I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I've never experienced prophecy. I mean, I've had dreams, but I would not call any of my dreams prophetic. I would call them generally, outlandish.
Eric, you said that you're not a prophet.
Correct.
Well, you're certainly not a liar.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Anyway, but as I said, we who are not give. It's like Anything else, there are so many things in life that you don't have a gift of something. You don't understand how it works. You don't understand it. It's like I know people who can, look at something and aesthetically say, this just looks out of sorts. And if you did this, and this, it would look much better. Okay, I can't do it. I can't visualize how things look. It's not a gift Hashem gave me. But on the other hand, it's like when I'm sitting there in the store and then trying to figure out how much the whole bill is going to come up to, or I'm trying to do anything with numbers, and I'm able to do it like that. And my wife says to me, how did you figure that out so quickly? So everybody has their area of expertise or their area of understanding that God has given them. And clearly, as I said, for somebody who's a prophet, they experience it differently. And I'm sure each of the prophets experienced prophecy differently. And clearly Moshe Rabbeinu was on a different plane than that. But all of the other prophets are probably from, totally at a dream and to almost Moshe-like. And I'm sure it runs across the spectrum. I mean, the Talmud tells us quotes two verses relating to prophecy versus dreams. One says dreams are chalamot shav yidaberu. Dreams speak nonsense. The other says concerning prophecy, that God tells Moshe, when he's talking to Moshe, he says he's talking to Aaron and Miriam, that every other prophet God speaks to in a dream. So every dream is somewhere along that spectrum, and I think every prophecy is somewhere along that spectrum, except Moshe, who's in a different category. And so how Avraham hears this or feels it, I don't know, but the Torah records it the same way it records ordinary conversation between two people, I think to give us the perspective that from Avram's perspective, he was certain what God was saying, and he was certain what he heard from God. As I said, I think that's really the intent of all of the prophetic works, is that even if the prophet may not have fully understood the message, they fully heard the message. And that's why it's written down that way. So in other words, the writing is what they heard. As I said, it may not have fully understood every nuance of what God meant, but I think that's part of prophecy. And I think for us to, yes, we clearly see the hand of God if we're looking for it. You don't look for it, you won't find it. But if you look for it, whether as an individual or certainly as we look at whether it's the events of 1948, 1967, and Israel, there are clearly things going on here that you cannot explain in any logical, scientific fashion. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Anybody else want to comment, questions? David. Yes. Which is made to be broken. Oh yeah.
Is irrevocable on both parts. Yes, there are sanctions you don't keep your side, but it absolves the other party from part of their part.
Correct. It's a much different concept than a contract. Yes, no question about it. And that exists. You're right. It does exist in all cultures, especially in the ancient cultures. I don't think it exists in today's world at all. Such a concept. Okay. Yes. Okay. So having looked at these two chapters from that perspective, I'm now going to look at them. We're going to start from the beginning again and go through these chapters a lot, not quite in the same detail, but we're going to go through them side by side because I want to look at some of the comparisons and some of the contrasts between them. And so we've got the next slide, the next page. Yes, come on, here we go. Okay. Now, one of the things, if you look here, you'll notice that I've highlighted the word brit or briti or habrit, any where the word is written in yellow. And I've tried to, and I probably have missed a few because, as I said, I always do that when I'm doing these highlighting, and I thought I highlighted something and then I saved it before I highlighted it and forgot to save it after I highlighted it. But there are going to be two different colors. One is God to Avraham / Jewish people. The other is Jewish people to Avraham. So again, if you look at, we're going to look first, we'll start at the right-hand column, the Brit Ben Abitarim. You'll notice the word Brit is conspicuously absent until all the way at the end. Vayomo karat Avram et brit leimor. That's the only time Brit is mentioned in the chapter of Brit B'Shalom, once, okay? But it's there to remind us what it is. And you'll notice there's nothing in green, okay? You'll notice there's very little in blue also. It's a dialogue, it's what they're doing. But the covenant is all about God to the Jewish people, to Avram to the Jewish people. I'm giving you the land that we've spoken about. That's it. That's the whole Brit. The whole basis of the Brit Ben Abitarim. God tells Avram what's going to happen. Yeah, there's going to be this slavery, this affliction, this strangers. Fine. But the only commitment, he doesn't ask Avram for any commitments here. The only commitment is God makes a commitment to the Jewish people that they will inherit Eretz Israel. So it seems that in some way, from this one alone, if I would only have this Brit, it almost seems as if it's an unconditional gift of God that we get Eretz Israel. And I think that's why we have this whole second thing in the same exact parsha, in the same context. And here you'll notice the word Briti appears over and over and over again. It is the theme word of this chapter. And as a matter, yes, go ahead. Okay, the column on this side, right? I'm pointing to, this is Tet Vav, right? I don't know what I'm pointing to. I'm pointing to Tet Vav. This is the Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant between the parts. This one is when God speaks out and commands him about the Brit Milah, okay? Covenant of circumcision. And if we look,
The one on the right is the first one that you read before.
right,
The one on the left is
Right.
the second.
right. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, so in this one, where it's talking about the Brit Milah, when we're talking about the Brit Milah, it is, again, the word Brit is the motive word. It's the theme word. You'll see it appears once, twice, 3, 4. The Talmud says 13 covenants were created over circumcision. Why? Because the word covenant appears 13 times in these two chapters where God changes Avram's name, God changes Sarah's name. You'll notice a lot of yellow there, okay? Now, unlike the one on the right where there's no green, no commitment to the Jewish people, to God, this one, God expects a commitment from us. Yes, there's blue. You got Avram, you will be the founder of many nations. I will multiply in verse 6, multiply you and you'll have lots of kings, power, all these wonderful things. And I will be your God and to your offspring forever, for generations. And then the Natati Lecha in verse 8, why would my mouse disappear too? Mouse, come back. Here we go. Natati Lecha, again, the same similar concept that we have over here, except here it's a little bit further down, that you will get the land of Eretz Yisrael, but here it's even stronger. It's lachuzat olam, an eternal possession, which is why if we study history, you will find that every other nation that had political or military control of this little strip of land was never successful in cultivating it, in building it, in growing it, because God said it's yours. If you're here, it works. If you're not, it doesn't. It's a desert. Read Mark Twain. If you don't believe me, read Mark Twain, The Innocents Abroad, his description of what the Holy Land looked like when he passed through 100 years before the state, 50, 70 years before the state was founded, before the Jews came back in earnest, okay? So it appears that God has given this territory to the Jewish people to the extent that only the land knows who its owners is, who its owners are, I don't know, owner is, and will only produce for them. And all of the prophecies that we have, whether it's Yeshaya, whether it's Micha, whether it's all of the prophets were prophesying about what will happen. The Jews are going to go into exile, but God will return us here. All of them focus on the rebuilding, the rebirth of the land, that there will once again be trees growing and plants growing and civilization. And history has borne that out, I think, to a very, very great extent. So that's God's promise. Obviously, if God promises, it's going to happen. But again, here there's a condition. There's a condition, as I said, he molachem kol zachar v'naltem et tzor latchem. We, the Jewish people, have to maintain the covenant of circumcision. All males have to be circumcised. And here it is, Obein Shmonat Yamim, when they're 8 days old, Yimolachem kol zachar l'dorotechem, Yilid bait, Miknat kesem, Mikol bein nechar, Shalom Yizarachahu, Himol Yimol Yilid beit chol Miknat kaspecha. Every person who is in a Jewish household has to be circumcised. As a matter of fact, if you, at the time where it was practiced that you bought a bondsman as your personal servant, and he was a member of your household and was not Jewish, he had to be circumcised before you could bring your Korban Pesach. Not just your family members, but not just your entire household had to have their circumcision, or you were barred from bringing your Korban Pesach. So again, link between Korban Pesach and Brit Milah, these are the only two positive commandments that failure to perform them carries, I guess it's being cut off from the Jewish people, karet, the penalty of karet. Every other commandment in the Torah that carries the punishment of karet is a negative commandment that you have to do something to, you have to really basically say, I don't want any of this. Whereas here, it's the same thing. By not giving you a circumcision to your son, you're basically saying you don't want to be part of the Jewish people, as I said before. Okay. And that's really, as I said, the whole focus of this is this concept of covenant, as David was saying, that here we see, though, unlike the first one, and that's why I wanted to put them side by side, unlike the Brit Ben Avitarm, where it's God promising us something, here it's God is promising us something, but it's conditional on us keeping our half of the bargain. And I think if we go through specifically the Sefer Dvarim, where Moshe is constantly reminding the Jewish people who are about to go into Eretz Yisrael after 40 years of wandering in the desert, the theme he establishes over and over again. Yes, God's giving us Eretz Yisrael, but it's not an unconditional gift. It's dependent on our living up to our end of the bargain, keeping the Torah, living our lives in a godlike fashion, and not as individuals only, also setting up a society that is based on Torah principles. Before I finish, I just wanted to make one last comment, because this same concept of Brit, and as I said, of oath, of a sign of the covenant, to remind us of it, appears other than Shabbos, which I mentioned, we have both Brit and oath, only one other time in the Torah. There's only one other place in the Torah where we have oath and Brit together in the same context. Anybody want to take a guess where that might be? Nobody? Nobody? Okay, so I'll have to go to the next slide. Want to take a guess?
Yeah. Well,
What?
the,
Keshet of, that's exactly, Keshet of Noach. Absolutely, very good. At Kashtina Tati, where do I have the next page? Here we go. The only other place where we have oath Brit, and it's mentioned not once, but 3 times in a span of 6 psukim. God says oath and Brit together when he says he's not going to destroy the world ever again. That there's a sign, that there's a tangible sign that God is a covenant. But again, this covenant also is like the one on the right that we had on the right before. There's no commitment expected from Noah and in response. This is God promising Noah unconditionally. Yes, I'm making this covenant. You don't have to do anything. And I'll remind you of it when you need to be reminded. So one of the things interesting, because the Gemara says that when we see a rainbow, that's such a good thing. We love seeing rainbows. Everyone says, oh, a rainbow, wow. The bracha we make is Zocher Brit V'Ne'eman B'Brito V'Kayim B'Ma'amaro. And there's an opinion among the poskim that says that you're not supposed to tell anybody if you see a rainbow. You can make the bracha out loud, and people can answer amen, and then they know you've seen a rainbow, but you don't go around announcing I've seen a rainbow. Why? Because a rainbow isn't always a siman bracha. It's a sign that, why is there a rainbow? Because God was really thinking right now, when you're seeing that rainbow, God is thinking, this world really doesn't deserve another chance. But I promised I'd give him another chance, so I'll do it. So I didn't want to end on a somber note. I want to end on a positive note that says that if we think about the concept of Brit, as David very, very, very nicely chimed in and said, the concept of a Brit in general is an agreement between 2 parties that both make commitments. There are Britim with God. There's a Brit with God where he makes all the commitments, but there are those where God expects us to live up to our end of the bargain. And we hope and pray that we will understand that we, the Jewish people, do have this commitment, and we will all move forward as trying to do our best to help others continue in their commitment, to strengthen their commitments. And when we're able to do that individually and collectively, we will be Zocheh to Kol Shleim B'Meher V'Meinu. Thank you very much. And I now open it up for comments, questions, feedback.
Yes, Koach.
Okay. Anybody in here want to say something? Anybody? Nobody? Okay. Okay. And I guess that's it. Good evening, all on the Zoom. Thank you for joining. And we'll be in touch. Okay. Let me close up here. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Oh, if she's here, she may not be here. She's here. Okay. Thank you. And tell you, I'll call her tomorrow anyway, but I'll call her later. Tell her, yeah,